So, warm welcome to this third interview on the occasion of the concert E Storm that Duo Signal is going to perform in Basel next April the 20th. And today we have with us Jon Yu. Jon, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's nice to do a little chat before the concert next month.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to start this interview with with a bit of a tricky question, maybe.
Okay.
And it is, how would you introduce yourself to the audience as a creator,
Hmm.
as an artist, as a composer?
That's a good question. Um, I think one important part of my musical beginning was that I played guitar in punk and metal bands when I was younger, in like middle school, going to high school, and then a little bit part of the college experience too. So I actually didn't start studying music formally in an academic context until I was halfway through college. So I was pretty self-taught for a long time, and I think that has sort of shaped my musical thinking and also my just practice and tendencies as a musician. So I think you know that this like path of a self-taught musician and then trying to come to terms with both catching up and learning about notated music and then switching to composition and then try to think about the sort of songwriting background that I had when I was
Mhm.
younger and playing in bands, and then how that translates to then writing music for other people. But another thing I think that came from playing in bands is the notion of a DIY aesthetic, like sort of do it yourself
Yeah.
aesthetic,
Okay.
um, that uh, I think developed in my musical thinking when I was playing in bands, and then when I started to doing experimental music or contemporary music, I sort of was gravitated towards that same aesthetic and that same community of music making.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think maybe that's like a partly introduction of
That's
my
like a huge and a very important part of your, yeah, of your current aesthetics
yeah,
in a
yeah.
way. And okay, because I mean, this is quite interesting, no? Coming from this self-taught background of punk and of punk music. And
Yeah.
how do you think, apart from this do-it-yourself aesthetics, how do you think this kind of music, because I imagine that you still have certain relationship with this music,
Mhm.
no? So how does it influence your compositional thinking or your yeah, your approach to composition or your aesthetics? How does it influence it?
I think influences it more in the social aspect of composition, sort of the way that you interact with musicians, and also the way that um, you set up your own concerts and you do your own promotion. And as you know from running the ensemble too, it's a lot of work to do on your own.
Yes.
But in terms of music, compositionally, I think I, uh, in terms of like electronics, some like electroacoustic stuff that I do, I think I tend to gravitate towards more kind of not low tech, but just like hardware based things of using transducers or um, sort of preparing acoustic instruments, sort of altering them and hacking them in a way that I think maybe came from that a little bit of that same aesthetic of kind of the rough sort of material texture that you get from playing sort of uh, punk music,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
lack
yeah,
of a
yeah,
better
absolutely.
word.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And in terms, because this social aspect as well, I don't know if it influenced your work or not, but of course, the listening experience when you go to a punk concert or a metal concert and going to a usually like a new music concert, they are quite different, you know. Like
yeah,
or for me, like the social experience in in a punk concert is like more maybe more intense or more engaging, more primal in a way. And it has uh, this kind of atmosphere, this kind of experience
Mhm.
also permeated the way in which you conceive music or in which you want your music to be heard somehow.
I think so. My relationship with that kind of like loud rock music has changed over the years. When I started studying composition, like later on in my college and also a little bit during my master's, actually there were a few years where I felt like I outgrew that type of
Hmm.
loud rock music, metal music. But it's interesting that the more that I worked with concert music and with notated music, the more I felt like every now and then wanting to go to one of those shows and
Yes.
kind of just experience the, just sounds filling the room and kind of uninhibited expression. And so I think I've always had a difficult time translating that kind of experience to like a more traditional concert music setting.
Hmm.
And I think also for me, when I go to those different shows, different concerts, like if I go to a new music concert versus if I go to like a metal show, it's a very different way of listening and a very different way of engaging with the music.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there are part of my more recent pieces that I try to think more about spatialization of space and in a way that might try to capture a little bit more of the immersive quality that you might get at a rock concert.
Hmm.
Um, so just kind of not so much presenting the music as just like a framed concert stage, and then try
Uh-huh.
to have it envelop um, the listening experience a little bit more. But of course, it's still very different. You never get really past that threshold that you would get
Yeah.
from a full on like sonic assault that you get
Yeah. Well,
at
I
one of the shows.
maybe with a proper sound system or something, then maybe you can get into
Right.
the sound or so. I don't know.
Right, you could. And it's also a little bit of yeah, like the people who might go to some of the concerts, it's a little bit of a when people go to rock shows or metal shows, they're expected to be
Yeah, yeah, assaulted.
to be overwhelmed, and
Yes.
sometimes even if I write I tend to write noisier music, sometimes I feel a bit bad for some of the to people who might not be comfortable with those sounds to be, to
Yes,
be
yeah, yeah,
subjected
yeah,
to
yeah.
do
But
those things.
yeah, but it's your way of expressing yourself. What can you do? I mean,
That's true. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
okay, and this I see that so this is kind of related because when I read your biography, you said that your main focuses are like ritual, utility, and excess
Hmm.
in a way. So what these three concepts mean in your aesthetics? I mean, what is excess? What is this ritual? What's utility? Maybe you have already answered those, but just maybe to clarify a bit more.
Yeah, I think yeah, that first sentence in my bio, I think has been there for several years now, and I think my explanations of how I think about those things also change over the years.
That's great.
And I think for me, um, my music has always I always have these two different ways that I like to listen to music. One is where the actual musical surface is more overwhelmed and it has kind of excessive information.
Hmm.
So materials that are more gestural or things that are pointing more towards either a sonic body as a metaphor or actual like performative performers' bodies too. And also So that's one sort of group of materials that I like to work with. But then there are also things that I like that's more static and more timeless, where you might associate it with more like a utility approach to managing sound. Things are more, you can see more like the overall form of
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
Um, so I so I think these two things are both very important to me, and a lot of my pieces are trying to figure out ways that these two elements can be in the same space, in the same piece. And When it comes to ritual, I think it has to do with just the way I tend to experience like a performance situation, and also a lot of my music, formally it tends to be a little bit circular. Like I tend to um, sort of approach musical materials in a way where it's like iterative, and I do the same things a couple of times,
Yes.
almost like in like I think of it as sort of just like a like a ritualized process of kind of repeating a gesture in a way to try to find um, new meanings for it, or new possibilities for them. So I think, yeah, so I think one explanation is that utility and access is sort of how I think about materials, and then this notion of the of a ritual is kind of how I try to wrap things together in some sort of overall shape.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. And well, talking about this kind of excess or the kind of overwhelming image that you had of this concept, that I mean that is suggesting me like the approach to performance. So how do you actually conceive this? How do you actually conceive um I mean, the specific approach to players' performative energy. So, uh,
Mhm.
is that something that's very important to you? Which strategies do you have maybe to achieve that? Because obviously, I mean, they are reading a score, and sometimes a score is quite it's castrating you from the actual energy that you maybe need to convey to the audience. So
Mm,
is this
yeah.
player energy important in your work, and how do you actually try to get it when translated it to the musicians?
That's a really good question. I think, yeah, of course, with our music, there's always like a score, like an intermediate, like a something in between
Yes.
the player and the public. But what I a lot of times what I try to do is still to work with instruments, and still essentially like an idiomatic way to the way that the performers would play the instruments. So even when I think about gestures that are uh, more more noisy, or a little bit more granular and more gritty, I still think about it in their terms of either like the body movements of a string player, or also just the use of breath, but maybe pushed to a little bit, um, uh, to push to like a different area.
Hmm.
So I think I still uh, try to write for those instruments in the way um, that are not completely divorced and separate from their the musicians' sort of original training on those instruments, hopefully.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And I think uh, in terms of getting those types of getting a certain types of energies from that, I think it comes from first trying to conceive of materials that are attuned to how their bodies are used to and trained to do, and then somehow have the materials be aligned with that, and then push towards a different space.
Mm.
um, yeah, I think.
Yeah, and have you um and in this regard, it probably really depends on which musicians are you playing with, and if they more or less know the kind of a sound that you want to achieve with those techniques. I mean, your scores are really carefully written, and you have very precise rhythms. So those, do you think maybe that that precision in writing disallow them to get into the actual
Mhm.
performance of it? Because um sometimes maybe when, I mean, when you have a score, it's like, okay, I have to play the score and I have to play it perfectly. But
Right.
sometimes what you need is that extra mile of energy. But maybe that extra mile of energy comes from rehearsing with them and collaborating with them and knowing them.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
again, how do you manage all these kind of things?
Yeah, that's a good point too, because I do think I have a tendency to um to over notate too. Like,
Well, maybe overnotate is too much. I mean,
it's
like,
a balance. It's a hard balance, right? Because you might have a, yeah, exact way that you want to have something performed, but then it takes
yes.
away from the spontaneity of it. Um, I think, yeah, I think what I try to balance is always to have the things that I add to the notations to have an internal logic to it, that once they start to play through it, hopefully that they will internalize, like, oh, like, this gesture tends to be coupled with this technique or something
Hmm.
like that. So there's sort of like a language that's hopefully that will start to make sense after becoming more familiar with the piece.
Yes.
And another thing that I've been trying to deal with more to think about more carefully recently is just sort of like vertical alignment too, like in terms of chamber music playing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's one thing that like kind of managing these more gestural energetic music on paper can be very useful. It's just like to guide these vertical moments of arrival.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of accuracy, when they really do click together, also creates a certain push forward too. So
Yes.
it's not just different entities kind of spinning in place, and then when they lock together, you get a sense of sort of arrival and then forward momentum. So I think, in terms of like rhythm, the way I work with rhythm, it's always having that in mind, to how to calculate, do those moments where they can actually sync up, and also things that they might be able to coordinate in terms of just working chamber music
Mhm.
wise, like playing together.
Yes. Okay. Now, we're going to change a bit the topic, I guess,
Okay.
because I want to ask you about I mean, your relationship with electronics and electronic music, etc. Um, well, I have several questions here. First of all, is which influence has the work with electronics exerted in your work? How has it maybe changed the way you hear sound or you structure sound, or how
Mhm.
does it affect, basically?
Yeah, with electronics, I've always listened to a lot of electronic music, but I think more recently I started to write electroacoustic music. So I've always had electronic sounds that I like, that I gravitated towards, and I think those are often things that blend very well together with acoustic elements, acoustic
Hmm.
instruments, or just acoustic sounds. So when I one of the ways that I tend to work with acoustic music is to have find ways for the instruments or for the acoustic sounds to also have some sort of um, elements that suggest like electronic
Ah,
music,
yes.
if that makes sense. So I tend to so one of the first pieces that I did for the kind of live electronics was for solo alto saxophone and electronics. So for that, I really wanted to have the instrument itself to also be a little bit filtered and a little bit distorted in a way that it's not a very separate entity where you sometimes in this live electronic music you have just the instrument and then you have the electronics to be a little bit separate.
Yeah.
So we did a little bit of preparation on the saxophone in a way where itself sounds a little bit distorted. So then when I did live processing, it was actually very simple things, just like pitch shifting or spectral freeze. So sort of finding original source material that really has a complex sound already, and then have the electronics to sort of just extend that sound a little bit to emphasize some of its pitches, or pull out some of the nodes in its complex spectrum. And another thing with electronics that has sort of shaped my pieces that use electronics is when we were talking earlier about the use of like immersive space.
Yes.
And I think that's one thing, of course, electronics really allows, is you can kind of spatialize things in a way that's very different than like a frontal traditional performance. So that has also got me to thinking about like spatial form in a different way, and also the possibility of using field recordings, which I like
Uh-huh.
a lot too. Is just kind of breaking the fourth wall a little bit of the performance environment, and then injecting something from the outside um, into the performance space.
Yeah. And I imagine that I mean, which software do you usually use? Do you usually use Max in order to produce this kind of live electronic things, or Ableton, or this specialization? Which
Uh,
software do you usually work with in that case?
Usually, right now I've been just working with Max, and a little bit of Ableton,
Hmm.
and Reaper for DAW. So
Okay.
yeah.
And
Uh,
yeah, and Max and Ableton. So what do you do with each of them? I mean, of course, Ableton cannot
mhm,
do the same things that Max. So, but
mhm.
what do you use Ableton for?
Ableton, I was doing a little bit of just like performing with dancers when I was doing some collaborations with other with different dancers, and I was using Ableton just to do very simple like triggering scenes or
Hmm.
triggering sound files like that, or having like a sampler with like a MIDI controller.
Yes.
um, so I was, yeah, so nothing super involved, but I was just using the Ableton for like live performance.
Yeah, in a very practical, I mean, in a very practical way, because it
Yeah,
actually works
yeah,
very, very
exactly.
easily. It's very true. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit maybe about an altar in three frames, the piece that
Hmm.
Dual Signal is going to perform.
Hmm.
Um, it is because you mentioned it several times, I think, during the interview, and it's that the fact of modifying instruments themselves, no? So like preparing those in order to achieve certain sonorities. So, how did you, in this piece, the saxophone has a certain preparation. So, how did you explore that? How did you reach the exact sound that you wanted, and how was the process of preparing the instrument?
Yeah. So an alter in three frames. Yeah, it was the piece that I worked really closely with Dual Signal with Adrián and Alejandro. And so we chose the alto saxophone because it actually has the same preparation that I talked about earlier with the solo saxophone and electronics.
Hmm.
So it's literally just a CD, a compact disc, that happens to fit perfectly over the alto saxophone
Yes.
bell. So I originally worked on this with Joshua Hyde, the saxophonist who I wrote
Yep.
the solo piece for, and we used that as a way to kind of filter and distort the alto sax, and then with him we found, just because the CD is mostly blocking the bell. So different fingerings, when he plays fingerings that covers most of the instrument, it will start to respond in different ways, and sort of like vibrating the preparation. I came up with different fingerings that worked well with Josh and his instrument, and then I sort of took them to to Alejandro to see if to hoping to see if it works for him
Yes.
too, and fortunately most of them also worked with him and his instrument. So that was sort of the starting point to sort of like have a reservoir of sounds that came from that preparation.
Mhm.
Uh, and the trombone itself also has a moment in the piece where Adrián is using the bassoon reed
Read.
to
Yeah.
play through through the instrument, and yeah, so that was also kind of worked on closely with him, and he has two different reeds that he was working with. And I remember the first time I rehearsed with him, I think one of the reed actually broke.
Okay.
And then we like he spent so much time like finding another reed, and then was like really like
Yeah.
trimming it down to get to get it to the sound like the pitch that the other one had
Yes.
originally. So yeah, I'm very grateful for the the dedication that to he's not even a reed player, but he's having to do.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, when you play this kind of music in the end, you needed a lot of
I
different.
know, yeah, it's just like, yeah, it's so specific too. It's just like, even with the preparation too, like it has to be on a certain way, and then it's like clipped on with the DPA microphone
Yeah.
clip, and but all of that, yeah, going back to what we were talking about of trying to uh play with the like the actual material of the instrument, and have that as one of the starting points of instrumental writing. And for that piece in particular, I was also inspired by some sculptural works by a Canadian artist, David Rabinovich.
Hmm.
In particular, he has this sculpture called sequenced the sequenced conic constructions in three domains. So it's a piece that has three iterations of the
Hmm.
same idea. So the idea of like a circular geometric form. So I also wanted to think of ways where the actual piece for the duo can somehow take on a sculptural quality to it, and that's one of the ways that I was trying to do, is to somehow have the music itself point towards the material of the instruments a little bit more, or to like draw the attention to them, and of course some of those prepared sounds, they have a little bit of flexibility in how they can change those sounds, but then
Hmm.
once you get the sound, there's sort of like a block of sound, and it's especially the bassoon reed, when there's a little bit that you can change with fluctuations and articulations, but it's
Yes.
mostly like a block of sound. So there's something of like a sense of like a sculptural mass to some of
Mass.
those
Yeah.
sounds too, and yeah, so that's All right.
Yeah, that's a like a great explanation of the piece already. So maybe I don't ask you anything more about it, so that the audience
Okay.
just get to experience the piece by for themselves. But but also I wanted to ask you, I mean it's related to the piece and also not related, but when doing all this preparation, I mean you talk a lot about collaboration with composer with instrumentalists. Um, do you also at some point grab an instrument and try things on it, or do you usually do you rather to have someone who is actually a performer of that instrument?
Yeah, I did that a bit with string instruments when I was studying at Berkeley.
Mhm.
After like checking out because you know they're at the school it's a little easier to get access to instruments,
Yes.
um, and with the string instruments it's also a little bit more uh, easy to sort of manipulate them for like an amateur,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah, true.
like
Yeah,
because I you know I don't have the aperture or anything, but
yeah.
I can at least like try them out very like crudely to see what some preparations sound like and what some playing techniques sound like. So for string instruments, I have I have a trombone and but you know I never learned how to play it. It was a friend's trombone
Maybe
that
you can buy a bassoon reed and try to do something with that.
I've tried that before. I've tried it with bassoon reeds before, but it's you know it's also it's another one of those things. It's like a different reed with has a different sound, and then you
Yes.
know I don't have the same like lung capacity as Adrian
Yeah,
has.
definitely.
Yeah, so I think more recently I've been working with just directly with the performer and like specifically like whoever I'm writing for. If they're open to experiment with things, then I would work directly with them.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, and I also found that um, yeah, and of course it's easier to develop a trust in some of those like preparation and techniques if they were involved in like the gestation stage of some of
Mhm.
those sounds too, and then hopefully they feel a little bit of like ownership to some
Yes.
of these like developments and techniques too, um, which you know always is always helpful for the final result.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is fantastic that you approach your work with that kind of collaboration, and yeah, you also collaborated with Duo Signal in the composition of this piece, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And and how was it? Did you have to rehearse? I mean, imagine that you had to do it online most of the time, but you
Yeah.
also had the chance to come here eventually. So,
Mhm.
how did more or less the process of collaboration work in this particular case?
It was really great, and like they were so generous with their time and with being in touch as I was writing the piece, and of course yeah we worked remotely when I was composing the piece, but I would send sketches to them and then they would you know send back with video recordings or audio recordings to let me hear what they sound like, um, and I think they played the piece quite a few times like before I actually visited them back in December, and each time they also sent me recordings of it, and they were also nice enough to let me change a few things too like after the first score, so that it was revised a little bit after the premiere, and then to finally arrive in Basel over the winter. It was a very great experience to finally to meet in person, also to finally hear the piece in person.
Mhm.
Um, and we yeah we they again were very generous with their time, and we worked a lot on the piece together to change like you know little small things here and there, and then to you know to watch Adrian like shape his bassoon reed. So it was yeah it was great, it was a great experience. It's very rare, as you might know, to have a piece that's performed like even more than once or twice, you know.
Yes.
So it's it's nice to you know be able to have such a close working relationship with people, and then have the music like played multiple times.
Yes, and how do you think the piece has evolved during these several performances? I mean, which
Yeah,
are
I think one of the things from the first revision was I cut out some of the parts, um, and I think one thing I noticed, and I talking with them too. I think like the more they play it, they start to tune into the form of the piece a little bit more too, just because it's like 12 13 like 12 minute piece, and it goes through quite a lot of stuff. So and I think it, it's like each time maybe they play it, become more used to some of those some materials, and of course it would change how they shape the
yes.
overall phrasing and pacing of the performance too. Um, yeah, so I think in these sort of subtle ways, like the piece, definitely has changed performance to performance.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, we are very looking forward to hearing that like next April the 20th in Basel.
Yeah,
So I have to wrap up here interview. I could be talking to you for hours, but we have
yeah,
limited time.
likewise. Yeah, but thanks so much for doing this. It was really nice to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for joining here.
Hmm. Of course.